Throughout the course of history, we can see a number of times that warfare has changed dramatically. The introduction of iron weapons, the introduction of swords, of catapults, of gunpowder. And World War I would make another significant change in the area of warfare. And in today's lesson, we're going to be exploring the lesson question of how was World War I different from all previous wars? Let's get started exploring this lesson question, scholars. Our main lesson goal today is to understand how World War I differed from other wars. But that's a huge idea, and that's a really big goal. So let's break it down. First, we want to describe the effects of new technology on warfare. Secondly, we want to explain how trench warfare created a stalemate. And third, we want to explain how World War I differed from other wars. In order to help us achieve these goals also, there are these words to know. Your academic word is prediction, and the rest of these are your domain-specific words. And those are casualty, propaganda, rationing, reconnaissance, and stalemate. At any time, you can look these words up in the glossary and add them to your e-notes, but make sure you keep your eyes open for these words as we go through this lesson together, scholars. Let me draw your attention to the top of the screen where you'll always find the lesson question, scholars. It says, how was World War I different from all previous wars? In order to answer that question, this lesson is going to be divided up into three parts. The first part is going to look at new technologies. The second part is going to look at the stalemate that occurred. And the third part is going to look at a new kind of warfare. But before we start into this, let's take a look at a map of Europe during this time period and see which sides were fighting who during World War I. World War I had two major powers, and you can see them here. You had the Allied powers of Russia, Italy, France, Great Britain, Portugal over here, and eventually the United States. The Central powers had Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Germany as well. And this is just in Europe, so we need to make sure we know this. Now, Germany was the most powerful of the Central powers, and because it was the most powerful, it had to fight a two-front war. One front along France, and then the other front along Russia. And this would have huge implications for World War I, and we're going to explore that in this lesson, scholars. Back to that lesson question, always at the top of the screen. How was World War I different from all previous wars? We just took a look at the two-front war that faced Germany and Austria-Hungary and the Central powers. And in this first part, let's take a look at the new technologies that were introduced during World War I, like the airplane. Let's get started with this first part. Industrialization that took place in a number of European countries led to new technologies, especially technologies that were used in wartime, such as airplanes, secondly, poisonous gas, and third were submarines. Let's start by looking at airplanes in warfare, and you can see an example of a World War I style airplane right here. Now we need to know that both sides used this newly developed airplane in warfare. Primarily they used it for reconnaissance, or they would fly the airplane over the opposing side's trenches to figure out where their trenches were, where were the artillery placements. If they had just bombed that area, what kind of damage did they use? And it wasn't until later when bombing raids and air-to-air combat actually took place. The second technology that was used during this time was actually quite a horrifying technology, which was poisonous gas, which was actually introduced early in the war by the Central powers, Germany specifically. Some of the major gases that were used were chlorine gas, which destroyed the respiratory organs like the lungs. The second one you saw a great deal of was mustard gas, which would blister the skin, it would blister the eyes, and the lungs. And because of this, many countries introduced gas masks, like you can see these soldiers wearing here. Kind of a terrifying thing about gas masks, about this type of gas, is that it would seep into these lower areas. So a lot of times you would have a trench right here where the soldiers would be hiding, but this chlorine gas, once it hit it would seep into this lower area. So even though they were trying to hide from these gas attacks, they were actually even more exposed to them because of the way the gas acted. Now, the third technology that was used were submarines. The Germans especially used submarines to sink military and merchant shipping. And they did this through unrestricted submarine warfare, and the purpose of it was to prevent the resupply of the Allied forces, like France and Great Britain. In addition to just military ships, passenger liners were also targeted. One famous passenger liner was the Lusitania, which resulted in the deaths of 1,195 people, including over 100 Americans. And this enraged the American population and actually turned it against the German and the Central Powers. Wonderful job, scholars. You finished the first part of the lesson. Only 2 more left. I'm really proud of you. Let's take a look at that lesson question again. It's at the top of the screen. How was World War I different from all previous wars? We began answering that in the first part by looking at the new technologies that were introduced, such as airplanes, but also poisonous gas and submarines. Now in this second part, let's take a look at the stalemate that occurred between the Central Powers and the Allied powers. When the World War I began in 1914, many people thought, well, it'll begin in August and we'll be home by Christmas. Problem was that they were not home by Christmas, and this war would drag on for years past. And these early predictions, they thought that it was going to be a quick war, but obviously it did not come true. The reason being is that Germany thought that they would be able to run through Belgium, attack France, and take them out of the war. Then, after defeating France, Germany would then turn toward Russia, then only having a one-front war. However, what happened is this. The French stopped the German advance. You can see here's the line right here. So Germany got right here and was stopped. And the Western Front turned into a stalemate, which happened around 1915. It turned into a stalemate, and this front, this Western Front began, and it was almost 500 miles long. And this was a stalemate where neither side, nor Germany or France and Great Britain, could gain an advantage. Maybe one would take 20 yards, and the other one would take it right back, and then one would take 2 miles, and the other one would take it right back. Neither side could gain an advantage. One of the reasons why they could not gain an advantage along the Western Front was because of the hundreds of miles of trenches that were put along this battleground, this Western Front. And because of this, neither side was able to seize significant territory. Now take a look at this. This is just one side of the trench. So let's say this is the Allied side. If the Germans wanted to attack this side, they would have to come through no man's land. They're completely exposed. They would have to come over this barbed wire, continue on, get over this barbed wire, and then finally get into the first trenches. But remember, in this trench, these trenches are completely lined with Allied soldiers, many of them with machine guns, who are able to shoot at will along all of the exposed Germans who are running toward this trench. And even if the Germans take this one trench, the Allied powers can fall back into this trench and fight them more. If they take this trench, then the Allied powers can fall back into this trench here. So you can see why it would take so long and why the trenches really led to a stalemate between the Central Powers and the Allied powers. And this was just the Allied trench. So you would have this exact same trench network on the Central Power side as well. The combination of trench warfare and the new technologies made warfare during this time period far deadlier than it had ever been in the past. Here are some significant battles that took place, and I really want you to think about the sheer number of casualties. At the Battle of Verdun in 1916, about 750,000 casualties. These are soldiers that were either killed or wounded during that one battle. The Battle of the Somme, that same year, more than 1.2 million casualties. And during the war, more than 16 million people lost their lives. That includes civilians as well as military personnel. You can see some of the wounded soldiers on the screen right here. The takeaway here is that because the combination of trenches and new technologies, the addition of both of those together really had significantly horrific consequences of warfare, especially during World War I. Wonderful work, scholars. We're 2/3 of the way through. Didn't think you were going to do some math and history, did you? Only 1/3 left. Take a look at the lesson question for me. How was World War I different from all previous wars? We began answering that question in the first part with new technologies like the airplane and poisonous gas. Secondly, we saw how the trench warfare and the new technologies came together to enforce a stalemate between the two powers. And now in this final and third part, we're going to look at a new kind of warfare. So let's finish with this final part, scholars. You're doing great. One aspect that made World War I so much different from all previous wars was the movement towards something called total war. And what total war is the mobilization of entire populations and all of their resources. So not just the soldiers, but everyone, the total population gets involved. There was the recruitment of soldiers, not just soldiers in the home countries like living in Great Britain, as you can see this poster asking people to join for, but also in all of the colonies. So Great Britain had soldiers from Australia, from Canada, from India, all those countries. There was also war-focused economies where the government took control of the economy in order to boost production of war goods, like war material, guns, and things like that for soldiers. There was also government-imposed rationing, where civilians could not get a hold of things like bread, like sugar, like meat, and the idea of that was to keep it for the soldiers in the front. There was also the widespread use or the widespread attacking of civilian targets like cities, which had never happened in great amounts as it did in World War I in previous wars. In addition to this, you also saw the widespread use or the rise of propaganda. Now, propaganda is just the manipulation of information to help or hurt a cause. You can see an example of propaganda right here, and we're going to talk about that poster in a second. But it had many purposes. One, it was to win public support for the war and increase the hatred for the enemy. So you wanted people in Germany to really support the German army, but you really wanted people in Germany to despise the French who they were fighting against. Secondly, it was to encourage people to join the armed forces. You saw an example of that in the picture right before this. Third was to influence the public's behavior. Let me draw your attention to this this poster right here, where it says, "Don't waste bread! Save 2 thick slices every day and defeat the U-boat." So you can see the British lady right here, they're asking her to save some of this bread. And the idea is that by saving this bread, by saving these resources, you will allow the British warship to defeat, if you look closely, it's destroying a German U-boat. That's what we're talking about here. And the fourth and final one was to influence neutral nations, especially Americans, in supporting the Allies. So you would see periodicals come in or be written in American newspapers encouraging them to join the war effort or support the Allied powers. And so these are just some ways that World War I was much different from all previous wars, scholars. Another aspect that made World War I so much different from previous wars was the widespread savings with war bonds that were issued. Now, how these worked is that the government sold savings bonds to help finance the war, and the people, the citizens of Great Britain, for example, would purchase those war bonds, and the people gained interest and were repaid after many years. So what it would do is you would buy a war bond for, let's say, $25 if you were in the United States. However, after a few years, let's say 10, 15 years, that $25 you gave the government, you would actually get back $50, so the price would raise. And this idea of buying war bonds was supported with propaganda, where it says, put it into the national war bonds, and the idea is you are supporting your soldiers. The role of women also was much different during this time period, during World War I, where women took new roles during the war. Many millions, in fact, of the men were going to the Western Front or the Eastern Front in order to fight, but they still needed workers to make the bombs and the guns and the war supplies. So women replaced men in factories and assembly lines, and the women made weapons and war materials. You can obviously see a woman right here making an artillery shell. In addition to that, many women joined the Red Cross as volunteers, where they would actually get very close to the Western Front and work in the medical capacity as well. So again, some more ways that World War I was so much different from all previous wars, scholars.